the key idea is that utilizing only a text prompt as guidance, 3D Paintbrush generates local textures on bare meshes, and our approach produces a localization map and a highly detailed texture map which conforms to it.
Welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. We host early career academics and PhD students to share their cutting-edge research in computer vision, machine learning, and everything in between. I'm your host, Itzik Ben Shabbat, a researcher by day and podcaster by night. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today we'll be talking about the paper 3D Paintbrush, local stylization of 3D shapes with Cascaded Score Distillation. This paper was published in CVPR 2024, and I'm happy to host the first author of the paper, Dale Decatur. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, Itzik. Thank you so much for having me here. Excited to be on the podcast. My name is Dale Decatur, and I am a rising third-year PhD student at the University of Chicago with the 3DL Lab. I am advised by Rana Hanukkah. And this summer, I am interning at Adobe Research. And so far, my work has focused on text-driven localization and local editing of 3D shapes. And more generally, my research interests are in 3D computer vision.
And who are the co-authors of the paper?
Yeah, so the co-authors are Itai Lang, Kfir Aberman, and Rana Hanukkah, my advisor.
Excellent. Okay, so in a TLDR kind of format, tell me, what is this paper about?
Yeah, so I guess at a high level, the idea is you have some existing 3D representation. In our case, we're using meshes, and you have some text prompt that describes some local edit that you want to make to that mesh. And the interesting part is that we only want to change some very specific region on this mesh, and that is defined by our text prompt. So, the tricky part is like, how can we figure out where on the mesh we want to edit? And then also, once we've figured that out, how can we actually make some highly detailed texture edit to that region?
Super interesting. Can you give like a small example just so we know what you're talking about? Let's say you have a mesh of, I don't know, a small cow.
Yes, that's one of the examples we show in the paper, right? So we have Spot the Cow, and we have some text prompt that says something like a gold chain necklace. And the idea is like, how can we figure out, where should a necklace even go on a cow? And then once we figure that out, also, how do we add, the details of the individual chain links and making this thing sort of look realistic and high resolution. The two main components of our paper are sort of, figuring this out. How do we actually localize this edit? And also, how do we provide high enough resolution supervision in order to actually get these high frequency details of the necklace on the shape? And we do this through a method called Cascaded Score Distillation, which I'll talk a little bit more about later.
Yeah, before we dive in, it's really important for me let's first nail down the introduction, right? So what problem is the paper addressing?
Yeah, so the problem that we are trying to address is this problem of localized texture editing. There are a lot of works out there that do text to 3D generation. So either generating the entire 3D representation from scratch, or maybe if you have some existing mesh, just generating a texture from scratch over that entire mesh. But a lot of these methods focus entirely on this global generation, and we're really interested in this local generation. And this is actually an interesting problem because a lot of times users or artists or whoever is using the software is interested in making very specific edits to their 3D representation without changing the underlying texture that they started with. So imagine you have some teddy bear and you wanna make some change to that teddy bear, like maybe putting a hat on it or something like that. But you don't want to just generate some new teddy bear with a hat. You want to keep all of the characteristics of your original teddy bear. And if you do some global generation method, you might faithfully get this hat generated, but then you're going to sort of lose the aspects that give your teddy bear its identity in the first place. So you want to be able to like make these changes without losing the identity of your original starting object. So it's important to have this local editing ability.
Yeah, that's very cool. But tell me, why is it an important problem to solve? So where can you use this kind of method?
Sure. So I think this is definitely really helpful for 3D artists and really just anyone trying to work with 3D models. So, nowadays 3D models are being used in all these different fields, anywhere from manufacturing to medicine to entertainment. And, the current tools are, at least the non-automated ones are quite tedious to use. So in order to be able to edit some 3D model, you have to learn some complicated software that takes, a lot of time investment to learn. And then even once you've put in the time to learn the software, actually going about manipulating and editing that asset is still sort of a very manual process that takes hours oftentimes. So we want something that's much easier to work with, and that will allow us sort of almost democratize this 3D content creation and editing fields that sort of anyone can do it regardless of your technical background.
Wow, that's super useful, right? I keep thinking about my 10-year-old son, right? He's playing all of these video games. He wants to edit his own avatar or something. So instead of learning all of the details of how to, work with some CAD software or editing software that he will need to master and have like a very, very strong background, all he needs to do is take the asset, right? The 3D asset, the mesh, put in some text prompt, and bam, he has cool sunglasses on his avatar or something like that, right?
Yeah. I think the fact that we're using text guidance, and again, all of the works that use text guides, I think it's a really interesting modality to use because it's so intuitive, I feel like. So everyone can almost describe the edit they want with text quite easily. And you can also be quite specific as well. So if you have certain nuances that you want to describe with your text prompt, you can just sort of add a few words here or there, or maybe remove some words and sort of get a very precise description of the edit you want to make.
Right. But tell me, what are the main challenges here there then?
Sure. So I think in this local editing task, one of the ones I've sort of brought up already is this issue of editing only the region we're interested in. So, it's difficult to basically ensure that when we go to change certain aspects of our texture, that we're not losing the identity of the existing texture. So that's definitely a challenge. And then also because we're trying to make these very local edits, because the regions we're trying to change are so small, the actual texture we want to be editing, we want it to be at a very high resolution so we can actually sort of see these changes. So another thing is we have to be able to get very high resolution supervision for our optimization, which is also difficult.
Right. So if I go back to the example of my son trying to fix up his avatar to be really, really cool with some nice sunglasses, it's about finding where sunglasses go. I guess for human avatars, that's an easy problem. But if you start having animal shaped avatars, then it starts being a more difficult problem. But not only that, once you found where to put it, you need to figure out how it looks like and make it look good, right? Higher resolution. So have it sharp and crisp and look faithful to reality in some way.
Exactly. And I think one thing you said there was the fact that on a human model, putting sunglasses in the right spot seems easier. But then oftentimes we want to be able to support sort of these more general approaches where if you tell a human to put sunglasses on a cow, it should, have some, as a human, you should be able to reasonably know where to put them. And I guess it's not always obvious that sort of a more automated method would be able to do that. But I think because of the way that these models are trained and all the data they've seen, they actually show some really nice generalization properties in that respect as well.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what are the specific contribution of this particular paper then.
Sure. So I think, the most straightforward contribution is that we give, in a way, the state of the art for localized editing on meshes. So if you want to edit the texture of a mesh locally, the results that we're able to produce outperform the baselines that we've sort of seen before. And then I think another contribution that is a little bit more general beyond just this local editing task is this notion of this cascaded score distillation. And again, I'll explain a little bit more later. But the general idea is that this approach allows us to get higher resolution supervision from our pre-trained models than standard score distillation by using multiple stages of the diffusion model. And this can be used for most any kind of text to 3D generative task. So it isn't restricted to meshes. You could use it on voxels, on NeRFs, on 3D Gaussian splatting. And again, it's not specific to stable diffusion or deep float or any kind of diffusion model as well. It's more of a general technique for distilling diffusion models at a higher resolution.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I can't wait to dive into that. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about related work. Okay, so if you had to name like one or two papers that people have to read or should read before coming to read 3D Paintbrush, which papers would those be?
Sure. So I think there's sort of two main avenues of papers that you should sort of consider. So the first one is papers that focus on how we can use 2D pre-trained models to supervise 3D optimizations. And the main ones that I think would be really important would be Dream Fusion and Score Jacobian chaining, which sort of almost concurrently introduced this concept of score distillation sampling, or SDS as it's often referred to. And this is a process for, like I said, supervising your 3D optimization by distilling some understanding from some pre-trained 2D model. So I think that's definitely one important avenue because, again, one of the contributions of this paper is sort of trying to improve the resolution of that supervision, building off of those works. The other avenue is with these text-based localization and segmentation works in 3D. So, this paper, 3D Paintbrush, is actually building off of one of our previous papers, 3D Highlighter. And the idea behind that paper is like, okay, given some text, can we actually figure out where on the 3D shape best corresponds to that text prompt? And our method section that we'll talk about later sort of directly uses a lot of the techniques introduced in that paper for actually finding our local edit region.
Wow, super cool. I'll make sure to keep I'll make sure to put links in the episode description so people can reach those papers and read them before they read yours. And it's time to get down to it. So what did you do and how did you do it?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, the idea, like we said, is we have some mesh and we have some text, and the text describes our local edit we want to make to our mesh. And we want to say, how can we sort of combine these to get some new texture that's only in this local region? So the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out how we're going to localize the edit region. And again, this approach is almost directly pulled from the 3D highlighter work. And the motivation for that is like, if you look at a lot of these text to 3D generative methods, there's actually seems to be quite a lot of semantic understanding in these results. So if you ask something like Dream Fusion or text to mesh or any of these, there's all these works coming out now that are working on text to 3D. If you ask them to generate maybe a cow wearing a hat, they're able to do that, right? So clearly these generative models understand something about the semantics of like where a hat should go on a cow, or, even maybe a more straightforward one, like, a tie on a person. Basically, there's clearly some global semantic understanding in these 3D generations. So then the question becomes then, is there some way we can extract that? So can we have some kind of like more analytical approach using this like more generative loss? So the idea behind, I'll go back to 3D Highlighter a little bit because it's sort of directly building off of that, is that standard approaches for text to 3D typically, or at least let's say you're doing like text to texture over the surface of a mesh, you're going to predict maybe like colors over the surface of this mesh to get your texture. And that's great, but the question is like, well, what if we want to do this localization or segmentation? So the general approach that we follow in that paper is we say, okay, instead of predicting RGB colors, what if we just directly predicted localization or segmentation probabilities? But then the question is like, okay, well, given that, how do we actually supervise this? Because as we said, we've noticed that these generative losses are very clearly have this global understanding, but how can we sort of formulate this in a generative way? So what we do is we take those probabilities that we've predicted over the surface of the mesh, and we actually color our mesh entirely dependent on those probabilities. So we'll do something where like the higher the probability of a certain point on the surface belonging to the region that we're trying to localize, the higher the probability of that, we'll color it more yellow. The lower the probability, we'll color it more gray. And we'll have this sort of continuous blend between gray and yellow over the surface of our mesh. And then when we go to do our optimization, we'll give it some text prompt that says something along the lines of, if we go back to the cow wearing a hat example, or let's say just cow wearing sunglasses, we'll say like, okay, a gray cow wearing yellow sunglasses. Now, again, we've seen from the text to 3D like generative side of things, we're able to get a reasonable result along those lines where it actually puts like yellow in the region of the sunglasses. So by doing that, in order to actually have yellow in the correct region and gray in the correct region, it has to actually have the underlying probabilities be correct. So basically, by learning this sort of like very contrived generative problem, we're actually learning the correct segmentation probabilities that we care about for either localization or local editing farther down the line.
Right. So let me quickly recap, see that I understand what you just explained, right? So you basically take the original text prompt that you've got, right? And you process it in such a way to, let's say we had like the cow and wearing sunglasses, right? That we want to generate. So then you take that and instead of, and for the 3D highlighter part, right? Where you want to just to do the localization, you first process this prompt in order to say a cow with yellow sunglasses, right? So now you know what you're looking for and you can really kind of generate a 2D image of this kind of thing that would get the correct localization of things, right? So you basically now, all you need to do on the mesh side, on the 3D side, is take the mesh and color it, right? So you have the probability that you're predicting. How, by the way? How are you getting the probability?
Yes, that's a great question. So we're using neural fields. So we use like a very simple MLP. I think it's like 6 layers. It's just sort of pretty straightforward. And it's a coordinate network. So it's going to take in an XYZ coordinate. And in the case of the localizations, it's going to predict a single value that corresponds to that probability of being in the localization region.
Right. But
so basically, we'll just pass. Yeah.
If you take an XYZ coordinate, you need to do some mapping back to the UV space, right? Or
yes, so that's a great question. So I guess we can, or I think I'll talk about that in a second after this. But so hold that thought for a second. But yeah, so let's just assume assume we already have these 3D coordinates. But the idea is, okay, so like we have this 3D coordinate for all the points on the surface, or at least for some selection of those points, we can pass those points through the coordinate network and get probabilities. And then based on those probabilities, we can find the colors by doing this sort of like yellow to gray blend. And then once we have those colors, we can then render our mesh differentiably and then do this comparison to the 2D images that we're sort of being able to get from our pre-trained diffusion model.
Right. Super interesting. Very cool way of solving this problem.
So I guess you had said earlier about the how do we figure out what points on the surface to select. So there are a bunch of different ways you can go about texturing a 3D mesh. So one sort of straightforward option is to directly color the vertices, and that'll work. But in order to get high resolution and high frequency textures over the surface of your mesh, you need to have a very high resolution mesh with lots of vertices. Because if you want to get the color at a point on the surface between existing vertices, you have to interpolate between the colors at those vertices. You can't really do something more high resolution. So a common approach is to actually use texture maps in order to represent the texture of our surface. And these texture maps are completely, the resolution of them are independent from the resolution of our mesh, which is great. So we can work with a computationally easy to work with lower resolution mesh and just have a higher resolution texture map. Mm-hmm. But then the question becomes, because we're doing our coordinate network in 3D, which is important for certain reasons like getting smooth textures. Basically, the idea is like we have 2 similar points in 3D input space. We want their colors to be relatively smooth in the output space. So, that's one of the benefits of using these coordinate networks. But then when you're going to use texture maps, it's a little bit confusing as to like, how do you get that, right? Because the texture map is in 2D. So like you can have, I guess, I don't know if the viewers would be familiar of how you actually create these texture maps. But the idea is like you have to basically flatten your 3D surface into a 2D plane. And in order to do that, you often have to like cut up the surface at certain points. So sometimes points that are close together in 3D will actually be far apart in your texture map. So if you were to maybe directly do a coordinate network over the 2D texture map, that might give you a non-smooth result. So what we end up doing is we actually say, well, because we have this mapping between our 2D texture map and our 3D surface, we can just go the reverse direction, take all of the pixels in our texture map, often referred to as texels, and just map those back to the 3D surface. And then those will be the coordinates that we query our neural field with, our coordinate network with. And we can get the colors for those coordinates and then just directly plop them right back on the texture image. And then we can go back to our, efficient high resolution rendering that we want to do.
Yeah, let me spend a minute of explaining what a texture map is to those listeners that haven't come across this this term. So I think the way I like to explain it or to visualize it in my head, right? Imagine that you have you have a triangle mesh, right? That's a 3D shape, and then you start cutting it along some edges, right? And because you want to flatten it essentially, but it's very difficult to flatten the entire mesh, right? So you have to make cutouts. Now, then you take those cutouts and you flatten them, right? So you can have a cutout of just a part of the face, and then a cutout of a part of the body, and then a cutout of the leg. And in the texture map, they can exist in very, very distant places, even though that in XYZ coordinate space, they're very close to each other, right? And what they just said is that you want this smoothness, right? You don't want to have 2 points that are close together in XYZ, right, to have very different textures, right? Even though in UV space, and UV space is this image of the texture map, basically, 2 points that are close together in XYZ coordinate can be very, very far away, right? So that's a very important thing to understand before we can even go further. But yeah, okay. So you train your neural field, right? You have your XYZ as input coordinate. You feed it into an MLP that's active. What's the activation function? Is that a ReLU or some more?
Yes, we use ReLUs. Yeah, I mean, I didn't look too much into perfectly optimizing this neural field, but I think we just used a very straightforward architecture. I think it was 256 width. I think it was 6 layers using ReLU activations.
Yeah.
Sort of run of the mill kind of thing.
Just your standard MLP. You put XYZ coordinates in, and you get as output the probability of that particular point being a part of being in the localized area that you want to segment out or out of it, right? So it's this continuous space.
Exactly. So that's sort of, I think, the first branch. You can think of our method as having these 3 branches. So the first branch is sort of responsible for this localization, and it does exactly like you said. So basically, for points in the surface that were, again, determined from this texture map, it gives you localization probabilities. Mm-hmm. The next branch is sort of, I guess, maybe the more visible one, which is the one that's responsible for the actual local texture edit itself. So the idea is we also want to predict RGB colors for this local region that is going to give our texture edit. And the way that we do that is, again, we have the same method for sort of determining what points on the surface we want to sample, again, by doing this backwards mapping from the texture map. And then for all of those points, in addition to the localization probabilities, we are also going to predict RGB colors. So it's actually a different coordinate network, a different neural field. The architecture is almost exactly the same. The only difference is instead of outputting a single value, it just outputs 3 values, one for red, one for green, one for blue. And the idea is now with this network, we're going to be able to predict colors over the entire surface. And again, I'll talk more about supervision later, but it's sort of supervised in the same way where, once you have these colors, you can sort of map them down to the mesh and you can render them and you can sort of compare to some 2D pre-trained model. The key thing here that we're doing is, one thing that's important to understand is when you're doing explicit localization for your local texture, you need the localization and your local texture to match up. So one bad example is if we go back to the sunglasses, there are actually sort of multiple valid ways to wear the sunglasses. Maybe you could wear them directly on your eyes. Maybe you could put them sort of on the top of your head. So there's some variation of these valid results. And, you might have a situation where if you're doing things somewhat independently, they might get, they might get optimized towards 2 different valid variations. So it's actually really important that we sort of synchronize this process between our localization probabilities and the actual RGBs that we're predicting over the surface. And the way that we do this is we say, okay, at every iteration of our optimization, we have our localization probabilities and we have our RGB colors that are predicted over the entire surface. What we're going to do is we're going to mask our RGB predictions using our current guess of what the localization region is. So, at some intermediate step, we have some decent guess of where we think the sunglasses are, and we basically mask it so that we're only rendering with colors that are inside that region for our texture. And that sort of ensures that this localization and the texture part line up.
Right. And then the third branch?
Yeah, so good question. So the third branch is actually an interesting branch, I think, because you might think that like on its own, just these two branches would sort of work. And for some cases, they actually do. But there's sort of this like degenerate solution that you have to watch out for. So if we go back to like just the top branch, which is this localization branch, on its own, it's able to do a pretty decent job of sort of figuring out what the correct region is. But now when you add in this masking that we just talked about, there's this sort of degenerate solution where what the network sometimes wants to do is it wants to localize the entire mesh, so it has the full freedom to color everything however it wants. And part of the reason for this is like maybe if you say like a cow, it very closely associates cows with like spots or something like that, and it wants to put like spots all over the cow. Even though you're saying gray cow, it doesn't care and it wants to just put spots everywhere. So what it does is maybe it localizes the entire cow, puts the sunglasses in the right spot, and then just also happens to put like spots all over the body. And that's not what we want, because now, even though we actually have the sunglasses, our localization mask doesn't exactly correspond to that local edit. And now we're going to be like changing the texture and regions outside the local region, which again is bad because like maybe we already had some texture for this cow and now we have new spots that don't really mesh with that. So we have to have some way of sort of like, when we add this texture branch in, that we don't mess up our localization. So we have this third branch, and what we do is we say, okay, we're going to have a third coordinate network. This one is also going to predict RGB colors. And then the prompt we're going to, and then instead of masking with the localization region, we're going to mask it with the inverse of the localization region. So now we're going to color it yellow in the localization region. And then everywhere that's the inverse of that localization region, we're going to give it the RGB color predicted by this third network. And what that's going to allow us to do is we're going to have some text prompt that says a cow with no specification of the color. We just let it do whatever it wants. We just say a cow with a yellow localization region. So in our case, sunglasses. So we would say like a cow with yellow sunglasses. And what that makes happen is like, let's say we had the degenerate solution where we had the entire thing localized, then this result would be entirely yellow, which would not match up with the prompt, a cow with yellow sunglasses. So this sort of like is like further regularization to make our localization region good.
Right. Yeah, you're basically adding a constraint or kind of maybe a soft constraint because it's learned, right, to have like the rest of the mesh except the area that you want to edit match the object of interest, right? The cow in this case.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have our three branches, right? You have the localization branch, then you have your the final branch is the background the background branch, and then the middle one is the texture branch, right? That you want to generate the edit that you wanted.
Exactly.
So how do you train this thing?
Yeah, so great question. So as we said earlier, once we have these colors and probabilities over the surface of the mesh, and I guess in the case of the probability one, we also have colors, right? Because we have this yellow and gray blend. So like once we have these colors for each of these branches, we can actually render them from multiple views. So we actually just sort of randomly select views from around the object, and we'll get these rendered images for each of these branches, and then we can do some kind of generative loss now. Which is, where the score distillation comes into play. And what we're going to do is we're going to have some way of basically getting gradients for these rendered images, based on our text prompt. So I guess like to talk a little bit about score distillation sampling, which is sort of the state of the art technique, I guess, these days in sort of supervising these 3D optimizations. So the way that process works is it gives you gradients for your image. And so I guess the way that I like to think about it is like, in standard diffusion model training, because again, the score distillation is very similar to diffusion model training. So in standard diffusion model training, you have some data set of images and you're trying to update your model weights such that you're able to produce things from this distribution of training images. In score distillation, you actually have a very similar loss term to the diffusion model training. But now you're sort of holding your diffusion model weights constant, and you're trying to sort of like optimize the pixels of some image to basically be in the distribution of things predicted by this diffusion model, if that makes sense. So that's sort of the general approach. So what we can do is, like we said, we can render our 3D representation into these images, and then we can have some text prompt that describes maybe the distribution of images that we want these images to look like. So we'll say like, a cow wearing sunglasses or something like that. And then we can actually use this, this loss, this score distillation loss, to get gradients for the actual pixels of these rendered images to push us in that right direction. So that's like sort of like this general score distillation approach. It's very successful. It has been used in many papers, and we even tried it and it works great. We love it. But the one thing that we sort of wish was a little bit better was like the resolution of the supervision. And, in most, more global situations, this is not really a problem because it's sort of already high enough. But for a lot of our local edits, we want to make sort of very small changes. And it's a little bit more important, I guess, to have high resolution supervision in these cases. So we started sort of looking at this score distillation loss and trying to figure out like how we could make it higher resolution. So one thing that sort of stood out to us was like, if you go back to the 2D domain, like one of the ways that people have increased resolution of like text to image models is with this cascaded architecture, cascaded diffusion models. And the general idea behind these approaches is you have multiple cascaded like stages or models, and they're sort of stacked on top of each other. So maybe the first model, takes your text prompt and outputs some lower resolution image. And then your second stage model takes that output from the first model as well as your text prompt again, and sort of like upscales that image to be higher resolution. And you can have multiple models all in this chain that will sort of give you this like very high resolution result, higher than just using the base stage. So that works great in 2D. And what's actually interesting is if you look at this score distillation approach, like in the original paper, Dream Fusion, they use Google's Imagen model, which is actually a cascaded model, but the score distillation that they come up with only makes use of this base stage, the lowest resolution stage in the cascade. And like we said, for most cases, that's actually sufficient and it works great. But we were wondering like, well, this seems like we're leaving a lot on the table. Can we utilize these other stages as well? So basically what we did is we made a few slight tweaks to sort of this score distillation formulation to be able to allow it to work with the super resolution stages as well. Because there's a few things that you have to do differently because now it's taking like, the previous stage input as well. It's very similar, but there are just a few minor changes you have to make. And then when you do that, you can actually get gradients at all of the resolutions in your cascaded model, basically, which is great. So now you have gradients at the base stage, which is like standard SDS, as well as whatever other cascaded stages you want, and then you can sort of combine those together into your supervision to get a much higher resolution result.
Right, and like what happens in these different cascade stages? Right, what do you see? So does the first cascade is basically some coarse kind of texture localization thing, and then the more stages you add, it gets like more into finer and finer details?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And I like when we first started doing this, I had like no idea what to expect. Like I thought like, maybe it would be like exactly the same, but then like just a little bit higher resolution at each like sort of successive stage. But it sort of turns out that's, at least in our experience using the Deep Floyd model, that was actually not what we saw. So what we saw is that like the first stage actually has almost like a better global understanding and like better adherence to the text prompt that you're using. So there's a figure in our paper where we're showing, localizing a watch on like this model of a hand and a wrist. And if you use like standard SDS, which is just the first stage, you get a result that's like in the right spot. The watch is in the right spot. It looks pretty decent, but it's a little bit lower resolution than we would hope for. And then if you use just the gradient from the second stage, also one of the nice things about, I guess I should interject this first, is that about the cascaded score distillation, because it's based on this cascaded diffusion model training, it turns out that the cascaded diffusion models are trained with each of the stages independently. So like the second stage doesn't need to know anything about the first stage when it's trained, which is actually really helpful for us because like, in cascaded inference, you have to like fully go through the first stage and get that result before you pass it to the second stage. That would be sort of too slow for score distillation. Luckily, because these things are trained independently and the score distillation is like very closely similar to the diffusion model training, we can actually sort of like do this score distillation on each of the stages independently as well. So, where was I going with that? So like that actually means we can do a gradient from just the second stage. So basically, if we take, supervision using just the second stage without the first stage, we actually get a result that is higher resolution. But one thing that surprised us was that the global understanding seemed to be like significantly worse. So it didn't put the watch in the right spot on the wrist at all. So it actually had it like closer to the fingers. So even though it was like higher detailed, maybe it's still not really a useful result because it's not in the right spot anymore. Luckily, if you combine the gradients from both of these resolution stages, you can get a result that is actually, both in the right spot and higher resolution. So that's sort of like this, cascaded score distillation approach that we're sort of introducing. But like, I think, as to your question, I was definitely very surprised that, these different stages in the model seem to be, better and worse at different things. I would have just expected it would just get higher resolution and they would sort of be the same everywhere else. So that was an interesting finding for sure.
Yeah, that's a very interesting experiment. I really like looking at it in the figure in the paper. And this is a great bridge to the results section of the paper. So what types of experiments did you do and how do you even evaluate this kind of method?
That's a great question. I think, so, in terms of the cascaded score distillation, I think that's like one thing we wanted to like very clearly show the benefits of. So we started with just some qualitative comparisons. So we give like a couple different prompts and we show what happens if you optimize our pipeline using standard score distillation as opposed to cascaded score distillation. And, through these qualitative results, we hope to show that, sort of the points I was just describing where you get like much finer grained details in the result. So, we tried to do that. And then we also tried to show qualitative comparisons to other text-driven localization methods and text-driven local texturing and also even just global texturing methods. Because it turns out there's actually not a whole lot of local texturing methods out there right now, at least for the time being. So for the methods that we compared to, for localization, we compared to 3D Highlighter, which is that work that I was talking about earlier. And we also compared to SATR, which is a work that does, again, text-driven segmentation. But their approach uses more of analytical. They're distilling a segmentation model from 2D to 3D, whereas we're sort of using more of a generative approach. So, when we compare to the 3D highlighter results, a lot of the ideas in our approach is very similar. But, first of all, we're using score distillation and in our case, even cascaded score distillation. So that actually gives us much higher resolution results because 3D highlighter was using like clip in order to supervise these optimizations. So we're able to get like much more fine grained results. And I think like similarly, if you look at SATR, a lot of these like models that were designed for segmentation aren't designed to give like super fine grained details in many cases. So again, like you can get like roughly the right region, but it's not like, it's just more like a blob in that region as opposed to like the fine, like if we want the sunglasses, like to get the fine grain like etchings of the sunglasses, it's like much more important to have these generative losses. So that's sort of one thing we find on the localization front of things. As for the comparisons to local editing methods, so I think specifically for meshes, there aren't any other directly local editing methods that I'm aware of. So we compare to latent paint, which is more of a global method. And, again, it works well for globally, but when you try and specify some local edit with the text, you run into the problem that we sort of described earlier, where it'll sort of edit the entire mesh texture as opposed to sort of focusing in that one region, no matter how much you try and describe it with text. It's sort of hard for it to respect that exactly. And then another work that we compare to is Voxy, which is for like voxel representations. And that actually does have the ability to do local editing. But we find that actually explicitly having this like generative way of localizing the region seems to give us like more fine-grained localizations than that approach as well. So, and also because we're doing the CSD stuff, it seems like our textures are higher resolution as well. Mm-hmm. So those are sort of like the qualitative. Sorry, yeah, what were you going to
say? Were there any unexpected results?
I think like we touched on this a little bit earlier, but like it wasn't, and this is sort of somewhat unexpected when we did highlighter as well. but it was not always clear to me that you would be able to localize sort of like out of context regions on some other shape. So like, again, like cows don't wear sunglasses, but somehow these 2D models that we're using for supervision understand enough about the concept of sunglasses and the concept of a cow that is able to sort of put these two together to get this result. And I guess it sort of does make sense when you think about the fact that it's able to do these generations, right? So if it's able to do it in the generative sense, it's probably going to be able to do it in our localization sense as well. But it's just, I think that's like definitely a very cool and interesting concept to me, that you can sort of get these out of distribution results.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay, so you mentioned the results of like the qualitative results. Have you done any quantitative evaluations?
Yes, and I think I mean that's one thing I think is interesting to talk about. But like I think it's very difficult to quantitatively evaluate these generative papers in general. So one thing that we do is we do a user study, like a perceptual user study. So basically what we do is we generate results from certain text prompts with our method, as well as the other methods that I was referring to. And that's how we showed our qualitative comparisons. And what we do is we actually take these qualitative images and we create some survey basically for different people to read. And then we ask them questions like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well does this result align with this text prompt or something like that? And we basically get users to sort of rate these things. And we ask them questions like, how high resolution is this texture? Things like that. So like basically you can get some sense based on the survey of like the quality of your results. But I think like it's still like a little bit subjective. So I think it's a little bit tough in that sense. We also run this like clip R precision experiment, which clip R precision is sort of just this metric that tells you how similar your generated result is to the prompt that generated it, which is, something that you would want to have in the 3D generative realm. So yeah, we run that as well. And like, again, on both of these experiments, on the user study and on the clip R precision metric, our method outperforms the baselines for both localization and for local editing.
And like, okay, so state of the art, bold numbers, everything's great. It looks great. When does it fail?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think, unfortunately, like any of these like SDS-based methods or these methods based on these 2D diffusion models, there seem to be these like ridiculously cool prompts that work really well. And at the same time, there seem to be these like very simple prompts that you think totally should work and somehow just seem to fail. So I think there are definitely lots of cases like this. And one thing that I find helpful is like, because we're using these 2D models to supervise our process, our optimization might take a little bit longer to run. But what you can do is you can actually just like type your prompt into a 2D diffusion model first and like see if it works well there. And then that can almost like help you figure out, it's usually a pretty good indicator of whether it's going to work in 3D. And obviously there are, many times where that's not the case, but I think, generally it's often a pretty good test of like, how well does the model understand this concept? So I think like we definitely inherit all of those issues from a lot of these like 2D diffusion models. Another thing an issue we have is this Janus problem, which is seeming to be relatively common in these text to 3D generations. So like if you say like sunglasses on the cow, it'll sometimes put sunglasses on like the front of the face and then also just on the back of the head as well. Just because it's sort of hard to enforce this 3D consistency in these optimizations. So, there have been works like since our paper that have like tried to sort of alleviate this problem. So potentially maybe you could combine our work with some of those ideas, but at least in the time being, we sometimes struggle from the Janus effect as well.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense that you inherit all of these problems from the 2D diffusion models, right? Like you're basically using them as part of your pipeline. So it makes sense that that's becoming like some, I would say some constraint or some upper boundary or something like that, or lower bound. And the Janus problem is it keeps repeating itself, right? It's because like most images are for a cow from the front, so you don't have a good idea how a cow looks from the back, so you just right. Put the glasses there as well, right?
Right. There's one other thing actually that I just remembered. So like, you were mentioning this like this upper bound idea, on the diffusion model side of things. I think there's also this upper bound on like the specificity we're able to get with the text. So again, a lot of our localizations rely on the ability of the diffusion model to be able to like understand our text prompt and be able to generate some image that respects it. So like if you look at the original like text to image approaches, if you told it to put like a blue sphere on top of a red cube, there was like a very good chance it had the cube be, it switched the colors or it switched the shapes and the order of where they are. And so like, associating sort of like almost adjectives with nouns seemed to be like a problem for these diffusion models. And I think these models are getting better at this. So like, again, one of the reasons we use DeepFloyd as our diffusion model is because it has the T5 text encoder, which is a bigger text encoder than Clip. And that seemed to give a little bit better results on this sort of like localization approach. But I think like as models get better and better at understanding this text, the ability to sort of like get these localizations using this generative process will get better as well. So I think we're like also sort of like limited by how well this text encoder can understand our text prompt.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. It is a limitation in a lot of 2D diffusion models as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so great method, great result. Time to talk about the conclusions and future work section, right? So how do you see the impact of the paper going forward, and have there been any interesting follow-up works?
Yeah, so I think like, the direct impact is like, hopefully it can help people, better make local edits. That's like, the task that we're trying to solve. And hopefully, I think that's like, we talked about earlier, why that's interesting for artists and other things like that. But I think more generally, I'm hoping that like this cascaded diffusion or like this like cascaded score distillation can be helpful to other text to 3D methods as well, because it's sort of like it's this general approach. It doesn't have to be about local editing. You can use it for any kind of any kind of loss you would use score distillation for. You could, if you're using a cascaded model like DeepFloyd, you can sort of plug this in instead and hopefully get higher resolution supervision. I think the main point I'm trying to get across is that, this cascaded score distillation is a very general approach that is sort of independent of the diffusion model that you're using, of the 3D representation that you're using. It's just a way of distilling a 2D model to a 3D, or distilling a 2D model for a 3D optimization. So, hopefully, anyone trying to do these 3D optimizations can use this approach to get higher resolution supervision.
Cool. Okay. So moving on to my favorite part of the podcast. What did reviewer 2 say? Please share some insightful comments you received in the review process.
Yeah. So, I like that question. So I think we already touched on it a little bit, but one of the main concerns with the reviewers had was the lack of evaluation. So I think when we first originally submitted it, we basically only had the qualitative results, and we hadn't really compared to all of the methods that I described earlier. So we had tried, basically said like, there are no local editing meshes, methods on meshes. So the best we can compare it to is a global editing method, and also we're just going to show these qualitative comparisons, and hopefully we can convince the reviewers by just showing enough examples to like convince them. And they made some very good points about how like you want to have more quantitative evaluations, and I think it's like we were talking about earlier. I think it's a very hard problem, especially in these like generative areas. Like, how do you successfully quantitatively evaluate these methods? But they had some good suggestions on like user studies and stuff like that. So I think like that was definitely helpful for us. One other thing that I think one of the reviewers brought up is that like we hadn't properly ablated the results from like CSD from this cascaded score distillation. So I think that was definitely a really important thing that we added as a result of those comments, is that when we did our user study, we actually added this one this column that basically says like what did the users think of the results when optimized with SDS versus optimized with CSD with this cascaded score distillation. So in the past, we had basically only just shown the qualitative results. And then here with the user study, we were actually able to see a significant jump in scores when we showed them sort of the cascaded score distillation optimized results. So that was a nice way to sort of actually almost like ablate the impact of this cascaded score distillation, which I think like, again, if it's one of the main focuses of our paper, you want to have more quantitative ablations of it more than just some qualitative examples. Like I think we only had like two to four or something examples of this qualitatively in the paper. So it's good to have a more robust evaluation.
Yeah, that's a really nice comment by the reviewer. I think, like, for sure, it was a lot of work for you guys during the rebuttal period to squeeze out all of these experiments. But I think, yeah, all of these diffusion, text to X generative models, right? Then it's really hard to evaluate, right? Because essentially it's either like it's a no go situation, right? Either it passes the human, test, or it doesn't. And then like this human, letting people see. So what was the experiment like? So you let people see the result of one method and the other, and then they had to kind of rank them? Or was it like, which one is better? Like, how did that, what was the setup for that?
Yeah, so we just took like, a bunch of different meshes and a bunch of different prompts, and then we generate a bunch of results, on those meshes with those local editing prompts. And then we do that for all the different methods that we're comparing for. And then we'll basically, show the reviewers a whole bunch of different images. And these images will be from our method, from competing methods. And for each of these images, they're going to get some score from like, 1 to 5. They're going to rank it and say like from 1 to 5, how well does this one correspond to the text prompt that was used to generate it or something like that. So like, it's not like they're ranking them relative to each other, but they are scoring them all, which allows us to sort of like look at their average scores and like see how those compare. And I think that's actually helpful because like a lot of times it's hard to like directly compare. And like, it's like very like you can have one that's like ever so slightly better in one case and then like a lot worse in another case. So it's like nice to have this more like score based evaluation so you can sort of like capture those differences.
Yeah, and I think a user study is definitely the right thing to do, right? Because essentially what you want to get is like the people saying, well, this looks good or this doesn't look good, right? And that's what the user study does essentially. Yeah, super interesting. Okay, so before we wrap up, one last thing. If you had one advice or tip that you could give a young researcher, maybe first year Dale, what would it be?
Yeah, great question. I think if I had to say one tip, one thing I would go with is like, and I think this is like, everyone says this, but like, I really do mean it. Like, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. And I think like, people focus a lot on the aspect of like, oh, people are here to help you. So if you ask a stupid question, like they're not going to be mad at you. They're not going to think you're dumb. They're actually going to want to help you. And I completely agree that that's true. But I think the aspect that is really helpful for me is like, if I'm in a room and we're like talking about some paper, there's a whole bunch of us here, and like someone asks some like, question that's maybe more like on the basic side of things, like how does, maybe there's like some term that people are talking about and, people are using it over and over and you're like, I don't know what this term is. And you ask that question and people like, explain that term. Oftentimes there are people in the room who thought they understood it and maybe didn't fully understand. You know what I'm saying? So like, I feel like a lot of other people benefit from this as well. And I think also, when you're the speaker and you're trying to describe something and, someone makes you ask some question that's a little bit more basic and you have to sort of like build something back up from the very basics. I think it almost like gives I think it's like almost a better way of sort of like teaching the concept anyway. So I think like, by asking these, maybe stupid or dumb questions, again, they're not dumb questions, but like more like basic questions, it sort of like forces, whoever's, talking about this subject to sort of like break things down to like the most basic level. And I think from there, like not just the person asking the question, but everyone in the room and even including the person sort of talking can get like a better understanding of the topic that we're sort of discussing. So I definitely, I think when you start out, especially, there's like all these terms you don't know. There's all these concepts you don't know. There's like so many new things being like, thrown at you. So being able to like have people, describe those in the most like basic sense is very helpful for you as a young researcher. And I think like you shouldn't feel bad about asking these things because everyone else in the room is going to benefit as well.
Yeah, that's a great advice. I think, it really depends on the environment in the lab, but I think like, when you're just joining a lab, everybody seems like so smart because they're throwing all of these, terms and they're like, oh, wow, they know so much. But well, half of them don't know the terms, but don't ask. But also some of them that use the term, they don't necessarily know it. And when you're a first year PhD student, nobody expects you to be the smartest person in the room yet. And even if they do, that's not a reason why not to ask questions. And I think you said ask stupid question. I'm like, I think there's no such thing as a stupid question, right? every
right.
question is a good question just because like you want to know this. So ask it, right? I mean, if you won't ask it, then you're going to have to do a lot of homework to, write it down and go and figure that out. And it's just easier to just ask the guy next to you or girl or whatever, whoever's next to you, what's that term?
Yeah.
And then they explain it to you and they understand it better. The other point I can make is that one of the things that I noticed in my kind of academic trajectory is that teaching a course, for example, is a great way to understand the terms, right? Because then you have to go way back to the basic because you explain it to, bachelor's or master students and they ask all of these questions. Then you have to kind of challenge yourself how to explain it in the way that they understand, then you understand it better. So great point, great tip. I like it. Is there anything you want to add that we haven't covered before we wrap up?
So yeah, you can check out our project page. It's threedle.github.io/3D-paintbrush. And here you can see, some of the results from our paper. We'll show some GIFs of some of our localizations. There's also a video, describing, our method, similar to what I've talked about here, but maybe a little bit more short form. And then also the experiments that we ran at the end as well. So definitely check it out. Check out our paper, and also like if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My email should be linked somewhere from that page. You should be able to find it. I'll happily respond and discuss anything.
And the code is also available, right?
Yes, the code is available on GitHub. That is also linked on our project page. You should be able to run it. We have basically, if you want to reproduce some of the results from the paper, we have like the pre-trained neural fields. So you can like directly run those without training them. And then we also have codes for retraining them from scratch as well if you want. And then obviously if you want to try your own text prompts, you're free to do that as well. So, hopefully that can be helpful for follow-up papers and stuff like that.
Thank you very much for putting the code and models out there. It's not trivial. That takes a lot of effort. So thank you for that. I'll make sure to put the link in the description. All right. It's time to wrap up. Dale, thank you very much for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.